Welcome aboard the BioTrain. In this video we're going to talk about the cell membrane. First thing to remember is that all living cells have a cell membrane. Even cells with cell walls like plant cells or fungi cells or bacteria cells, they have a cell membrane inside of the rigid cell wall. The cell membrane is selectively permeable, meaning that it can allow some molecules and substances to enter while blocking others. That gives it control over the internal environment of the cell, so it's a very important structure for maintaining homeostasis. It can maintain an environment inside the cell where metabolism can effectively take place, and that environment can be different from the surrounding environment outside of the cell membrane. So what is the structure of a cell membrane here? The cell membrane is made of a lipid bilayer with embedded proteins. So what does that mean? It means there's a double layer of lipids. These blue structures are the phospholipids, and then these pink structures drawn in represent proteins embedded in that lipid bilayer. So how does this lipid bilayer form and how is it maintained? Well, that has to do with the characteristics of the phospholipids, which make up the lipid bilayer. They have a head which is hydrophilic, meaning it loves water, and if water's around it wants to be up next to water. It likes water. And then there's a tail part which has the opposite characteristic. It's hydrophobic, meaning water hating, or it's afraid of water. So those tails of that phospholipid want to hide. If water's around, they want to hide and stay away from the water because they are hydrophobic. So what does this mean? This means that cells have a watery cytoplasm. Okay, cells have a watery cytoplasm. So there's water on the inside in the cytoplasm, and there's also water on the outside, either in the extracellular fluid or in the environment that the cell is living in. And this causes the lipid bilayer to form and maintain its structure simply by the fact that the lipids have parts that like to be next to water and parts that are afraid and like to hide from water. So if this is the inside, you have the heads of the inner phospholipids are hydrophilic, and they are lining up to be next to the watery cytoplasm, and the outer layer of lipids also have their heads lined up with the watery environment outside the cell, and then the hydrophobic tails are hiding in the middle. So this bilayer configuration is maintained simply through the hydrophobic and hydrophilic characteristics of the lipid bilayer. This allows the membrane to be fluid because these lipids are not actually bonded to each other. They are just maintaining that orientation because of the hydrophobic and hydrophilic characteristics of the lipids. So the lipids move around because they're not physically bonded to each other. And then in that structure there are many kinds of proteins that are embedded in that fluid lipid layer that's just maintaining itself. So that's what makes the mosaic model. So the fluidness is because the lipids are not actually bonded to each other, and then the mosaic is that there's a mosaic of many different types of proteins embedded in that fluid lipid bilayer. So one last thing to be aware of is that there is an outside of the cell, and a lot of the proteins embedded in that cell membrane are important and serve important functions on the outside of the cell. First of all, there are special proteins called receptor molecules, and these receive chemical messages from hormones and other messaging chemicals. And they are embedded in the membrane, and they allow the cell to receive information from the hormone system, the endocrine system, and that's part of controlling and coordinating the metabolism of all the trillions of different cells, particularly in multicellular organisms. There's also proteins, and the proteins in the membrane act as an ID for the cell, an identification for the cell to say, I'm part of this body, don't kill me, don't mess with me, And the way they do that is the immune system can tell if the cell belongs in that organism, as part of that organism, by checking the proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane. So it's kind of like showing their ID. The immune system is programmed to tell if the proteins embedded in a cell membrane are the proteins that make up a cell that's part of that body. So that way the immune system can identify foreign cells like bacteria cells or other cells that don't have the right proteins, and they can identify them, mark them for elimination before they can cause harm or infection in the body. I hope that was helpful.